Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to the University of Sussex, to everyone who's visiting us, especially any of you coming here for the first time. We're delighted to have you here at the Attenborough Centre for the Creative Arts. I'm Professor Michael Luck, and I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost of the University of Sussex. I want to thank you for joining us today for our annual Holocaust Memorial Day event, when we, as a community, remember the millions of people who perished in the Holocaust. I want to begin by stating that at Sussex we ask all members of the university community and everyone visiting our campus to hold in mind our shared humanity, whatever the differences of belief and lived experience there might be among us, and to consider carefully the impact of our words and actions on each other. We're committed to rigorous, rational, evidenced argument and respectful discussion. We're a place for open debate. And we won't tolerate anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or any form of racism, harassment, or discrimination. Our commitment to academic freedom and freedom of speech within the law is foundational and is essential to our work of education and research. Now, the theme for National Holocaust Memorial Day this year, which actually took place on the 27th of January, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Nazi death camp, is Bridging Generations. This is a call to action, a reminder that the responsibility of remembrance doesn't end with the survivors. It lives on through their children, their grandchildren, and through all of us. This theme calls upon us all to actively engage with the past, to listen, to learn, and as a university, to dedicate ourselves to rigorous research. It's through such inquiry that we preserve memory and carry the vital warnings of history into the future. We're honoured to welcome Malka Levine to the University of Sussex today. Malka was 2 when the Nazis forced her family into the Jewish ghetto in Volodymyr Volynski, a small city in present-day Ukraine. Of the 25,000 Jews in the city in 1939, only 30 would survive. Malka's father was shot in the first pogrom, but before he died, he begged her mother Rivka to save the children. The Association of Jewish Refugees has supported Sussex in putting on a Holocaust Memorial Day since 2001. In fact, we were the first English university to hold such a commemoration. We extend our sincere thanks to them for their support again this year, and are very pleased to welcome to the campus Alex Moores, who is their Head of Education and Heritage. Alex will introduce Malka Levine after the break. If I may take a personal moment, many years ago when I was in the 6th form, my school organised a conference about the Holocaust. Now, while I knew a lot about the Holocaust at that time, many of my classmates knew much less, but we were all profoundly affected by our experiences of hearing from several survivors who came to talk with us then. So I know the impact of direct personal testimony and recognise the huge importance of Malka being here today. Back then, the Holocaust seemed to me so far away, so long ago. Today, 40 years later, it seems sadly and scarily much closer. More local schools are here today than ever before, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to Sussex alongside members of staff, students, and those from the wider community. I also welcome all of you who are watching online. For our first session this morning, we'll be showing 2 short films. After the films, there'll be a discussion between Judy Ironside MBE, who is founder and president of UK Jewish Film, and Amanda Rubin, a documentary filmmaker and journalist who works at the intersection of cultural history, music, the arts, and science. Thank you.
Este tren lleva muchos vagones. No es como que tomábamos para ir a la playa. Avanzamos en silencio, siempre vigilados.
Dios klebedeke finger, בדיוק כמו אמא שלך.
פולין, 1942. לא אשכח את היום שבו התחילו הנאצים לחסל את הגטו. אני שומעת אותם מתקרבים. הם מגרשים את היהודים בכוח. אבא לא יצא מהמחבור. החיות התנפלו עלינו. ציפור עלי קודחת מחום. החלפתי 2 פרוסות לחם בתפוח בשביל ציפור. אנחנו נוסעים למעלה. אני עוזבת אותה. כאילו אותנו. אני שומעת קולות מתקרבים.
Thank you. We chose these 2 short films out of many that are made about the Holocaust, and particularly with the theme of bridging generations, which is really what Holocaust Memorial Day is all about. How do we teach the stories of the Holocaust to new generations? And we have many young people from schools here today, so it's really important to hear from you about what you've taken away. The power of film is incredible to tell stories. I genuinely believe that, and I hope that these stories today have touched you. Amanda and I are going to discuss the 2 films, and then we'd like to open the discussion up to all of you. So we have 2 very strong films, both actually made by women. And I know that you've been watching them recently as well. Shall we start by talking about Humo, Smoke, the Mexican film? Yeah, so maybe you could start by giving us some reflections.
Well, I was going to say anyway that, you know, I've watched these films a few times, and I'm watching them again, realizing how powerful they actually are. And I still am really moved to tears actually in moments, and that's the sort of power of that sort of storytelling with film, I think. So both immensely cleverly made, and they've got there's a real sort of efficiency, you know, they really distill down a kind of essence of that enormous experience in history and in this. I mean, Humo, when I first saw it, I just, you know, it just stayed with me. It's so pared down in a way. There's sort of the symbolism and the use of really simple things that we associate with childhood and that can tell stories in such a powerful way. is, you know, it's a magnificent, I mean, it's really a real triumph of filmmaking. So Humo means the smokehouse.
Yeah.
And it sort of all comes down to that.
I particularly like the use of animation that Basulto has made. She was actually pregnant when she first started the film, and she made it finally over 7 years. And her son, Dante, was the voiceover for the boy Daniel. And the use, when you turn to animation to illustrate the story, which she took from a storybook, it wasn't, unlike the second film, it wasn't her family. She very much thought about war and the impact of war on children. And I suppose being pregnant initially, although the film didn't complete for many years, she felt very in touch with the suffering of children. And as we know, that's very much current today. Nothing has changed. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think she's an animator, obviously. It's worth actually doing a bit of background reading, which I did, because it really brings the thing to life. Not that you need it. I think it's so sort of perfectly formed in a way. But when you get some insight into her process, this idea of taking a sort of child's perspective. I mean, both films do that, don't they, in a way? And this kind of simplified view of the world. You know, it's full of kind of kites and boats and the beach and all these things which, you know, that little boy never really got to enjoy again after that journey. And he's not a real character, but he symbolizes all those lost childhoods. And I think she brilliantly pictures the simplicity of being a child in the world and all its beauty with the kind of horror and the enormity of what happened and the reality, actually. So the sort of simplicity. She says, there's a really nice quote, if you don't mind me reading it. She says, "I appeal to a world of fantasy, to the nostalgia and innocence that we've lost in adulthood. The perspective of a child brings a deep voice loaded with emotion and pure feeling in an attempt to understand a world with an overwhelming reality in it." And she talks about the visual metaphors as a way to kind of express that. So really powerful. And animation, you know, can tell a story of our imagination without banging you over the head with it. It's just in the simple moments that you get all the force of that film, even stuff off camera, stuff that you're listening to but not seeing. So, you know, the sound effects are really important. If you watch it back, you sort of start to realize, you know, there's a sort of snap of a whip, there's dogs barking, there's the kind of lament of a mother. There's all these things that are all playing on your imagination with this very simple
and her use of colour and texture. The stop animation so often made with paper, something that could burn, the lightness of things being blown away and disappearing, which is actually what happened, you know, to people, to the children that went into the smokehouse. So I think with the animation, she's created such a sense of place. And she talks of how difficult it was. Although she was making a film very much about the horrors of war, during her, certainly the early part of the filmmaking, she was watching so many images and archive material from the Holocaust. She found it, as we all did watching the film, you know, very distressing.
Yeah, I think her use of colour is so clever. This kind of watercolour, sort of washed out, the way she uses the stripes of the I was going to call them uniforms, but they weren't uniforms. They were the dress that prisoners had to wear. Those stripes sort of washed out, light and dark, I really thought the eyes were really powerful. You know, they look almost like their real eyes, and the way they water. It's so strong, the feeling you get from it. And if any of you are interested to go online, her Instagram account has got some film of just the working table where the cutouts of some of the characters are, the wooden box of some of the characters are, and there's a sort of foam plate with all the different eyes in it. So it's sort of, you can see her at work in a way, and you can see how she constructed that so powerful, sort of immersive story.
Yes. So the animation and the use of animation carries us over to Girl 60427, the number tattooed on her grandmother's arm. And again, I think she's very cleverly used animation with the drama, with the narrative, as flashbacks. Many films do, as maybe some of you have seen, use actual archival material. Many short films and many of the long films we see. In both of these films, they've chosen not to, but to use animation instead to focus down on the scenes from Auschwitz, from the Holocaust concentration camps. So how did you feel about how animation was brought into that second narrative film?
I mean, again, I thought it was a really powerful film, and not least it's her graduation film from film school, so she's quite a young filmmaker, but I think it's a really powerful story. It's her story. I think it started off as a documentary. She intended to be a documentary, but soon got into that, I think, that difficult space. I mean, I'm facing it now with the film I'm trying to make, which is how to tell a story when you don't really have the materials. And we've talked about using archive. This archive's been seen so many times. We all almost switch off because we've seen it so much. So how do you bring this story to life? And I thought she did it really, really well. I thought that the drama mixed with the animation was really powerful to bring the everyday, bring this, her imagination and what she was reading and what she was discovering into the everyday, you know, it's on the kitchen ledge or, you know, next to the TV. And it's almost sort of echoed again later when you see her coming out of the water. And I was just thinking how there she is sort of walking on the beach, and sort of all of Tel Aviv is kind of normal, people are living their normal lives, and yet people are carrying these stories of immense sadness, and in her grandmother's sense, you know, absolute trauma. So she could not talk. And carrying in the tattoo.
Yeah. And when we go back to thinking about bridging generations, in so many families, the story was not shared. It was not possible for the survivor to share the stories with their families. I mean, obviously many did, and we've benefited. We're going to hear a story later today from a survivor. But often the story was hidden. There was shame about being the survivor. She saw her sister being killed, but she survived, and that made it so hard because the history is there. It impacts on the second generation, on the third generation, as we know, but the story itself hadn't been shared until she found the story, and it's actually the second film is told that is a true story. It was her grandmother who hid the diaries and was the survivor, and this was her student graduation film, a story she obviously felt really passionate about telling.
I mean, the diary was written in 1946, so just after liberation, and in Italy, when she was presumably in a camp. And she talks about her grandmother carrying the sort of the shame and the guilt of being a survivor and of not being able to do anything about her, witnessing and not being able to save her sister, and how she never felt she could sort of enjoy life, and you see that in her kind of
like she
rigidness.
didn't deserve to enjoy it.
Yeah, she couldn't release. So this, it's incredibly sort of strong, this idea that her granddaughter was able to find these diaries and tell this story. I mean, both films in a way are about storytelling, and I think in the first one you've got this sort of metaphor of paper and the flimsiness of it. Keep seeing paper being used and story. She used that as a strong metaphor for storytelling, and here as well, this idea that the story gets passed on, and the little girl who plays is actually her niece. They tried to cast lots of people, and nobody sort of fitted. So so she's actually playing out a kind of, a generational, maybe healing of something. Some way there's a healing in this film, I think, for that family. So there's sort of power of that kind of story and being able to tell it. But I think the subtleness of the symbolism she uses is really strong as well. It's called Girl 60427. It's emblazoned on her grandmother's. It's never to be got rid of, her tattoo. And she talks about how her grandmother would always wear long sleeve shirts. She wouldn't go out. Even in Israel, where everybody knew the story, she carried that. So that moment in the film when the little girl writes that number and then can't, it sort of becomes indelible. So it's really powerful.
Yeah. And we see some shift, some resolution at the end of Girl 60427. Her grandmother shows some tenderness towards her granddaughter. Yes.
Well, she says, you see her hugging her, and prior to that, she wouldn't. She was just sort of aloof and isolated and full of rules and things. And in a way, this is a sort of a wish fulfillment. She says in an interview, I wish I could have given her a hug. I hope that when people see the film, they will go and hug a grandparent and listen to their story, which I thought was very beautiful. And I think, all the stories that get carried down are so remarkable, especially of families who've experienced exile, displacement, loss, trauma. To be able to share those stories is so important.
And as someone who runs a Jewish film festival, I can tell you that these stories are still being told. New stories are still being made into films, into books. The power of storytelling, the power of film is immense. And we say never again, we learn from the experiences, but sadly, that's not what's happening. But it's so important to pass on these messages to new generations. Unless you'd like to add something else, we'll open it up to the audience for your comments, your questions. We have roving mics. Do please use them and share your thoughts.
One thing that worries me, and as an artist you might want to comment on good and bad art, there's so much commercialization, there's so much spin-offs of the dress seller of Auschwitz or whatever. And it's a worry that somehow people are maybe translating it into something more commercial without a message that isn't selling that is selling, and rather than just making art for the purpose of actually conveying information to generations. Is there a risk that people see that and possibly trivialize things?
Amanda, you're currently embarking on a film about the Holocaust. Maybe you'd like to answer this?
Well, I'm not sure we can control what happens to what we make in a way, but I think it's important that we make it and that we think about who we're making it for and why we're making it. And the film I'm working on is about dreams, dreams that were collected in the 1930s. And I've been working on it for quite a few years, and sometimes I go backwards and forwards thinking, what's important about this? Does anyone care? Is it over? Is it important? But when it comes down to it, I think in the same way that both these stories, I think, can, carry a message and a story and can help to bring to life a period of history that maybe gets taught in schools but can be also very dry if you try and do that. So I think as artists, we all have to keep making films and telling stories, writing, whatever, making music, and hopefully we reach an audience that responds and learns and feels compelled to want to know more. I mean, hopefully people will go and find out a bit more about these stories and reflect on them. And that's, I think, all you can really hope for as artists.
Questions, comments? It would be good to think about the use of animation, stop motion animation, which is a very slow process. The characters move and then you take another shot. It's incredibly intense process. And the Mexican film director, Rita Basolto, is not Jewish. She chose to focus on the Holocaust, and she chose to make this incredibly detailed, which I don't really think, coming back to the first question, was a commercial project. What she wanted to do was imbue it with the power to reach people, to touch people, and to make them feel something of the horror of war. That's what she actually says about it. Although she focused on the Holocaust, it was the horror of war in general terms that she was looking to communicate about.
The first film, I found it was like we were hearing the voice of the child. And it very much resonated, that start part where last time I saw my father, and then the journey right the way through to the end, and then the humanity, even as a small child reaching out for a friend, that hand, I thought was really that powerful. It really drove that message and that sort of experience that child would have gone through, even though that was not based, it's a fictional character, if we like, within it, but obviously what we could envisage children experienced in the horrors of what happened there. And then the second film, I think, is really clever about the way that it got you to look at the trauma. So the grandmother, often seen just looking almost vacant, and clearly still that trauma so ingrained into her whilst the story progressed, and the flashbacks that the granddaughter were getting were clearly the flashbacks the grandmother was seeing on a daily basis and trying to manage that trauma. And as much as the shared experience and sharing the stories, it does show that that trauma can be shared between generations as well and needs to be managed really carefully. And it can be understandable while people that have experienced trauma wouldn't want to share that and put it especially onto loved ones. So I found that really powerful in relation to that. And I suppose the question would be, is how putting that across in filmmaking is really important, I suppose, because you are taking that story and sharing it on behalf of those survivors. So do you feel that that's what empowers you, I suppose, to provide that?
Yeah, I think, as I was saying, sort of from the perspective, as a filmmaker, sort of facing this, there's been so many films about the Holocaust. How do you bring fresh perspective? How do you keep an audience engaged? How do you keep telling this story to new audiences? And as with any storytelling, I think it is about, the kind of raw emotion that is what gets you, that sort of moment. And so finding that, I think it's quite profound. That little boy didn't survive, his voice didn't survive, but somehow somebody started as a book, an illustration, and then picked up by Rita, was able to capture that sense of it. And then that film lives on to tell that story. But I do think that, it'd be really good to hear from young people today, because you're so inundated with imagery. There's so many stories. There's just this constant sort of almost noise, but lots to get through. And I just wondered whether any of you are engaged in storytelling or interested in telling the stories of your families, or stories that just get carried. People you meet might, have a really powerful story that touches you, and then that ends up being something you want to share. And I think that's how story, sort of chain of memory in a way, how we pass that on in a way that AI can't help us with. It's the human experience that we're really trying to get to the core of.
How long do one of these short films take to create?
I spoke earlier about Rita Basolto making this film over 7 years. And we've got to take in the sort of economics of it too. Filmmakers don't find it very easy to earn money. So Rita Basolto actually worked, during the making of this film, she actually worked on the most recent Pinocchio, which was an international success. So she was earning while she did that. And that, she says, is part of the reason that Humo took so long. But I think the two working on the animation of Pinocchio actually fed into Humo as well. So that's particularly long to take 7 years over a film. I think that Girl 60427, since it was a school, it was the graduation from the Malay Film School in Israel. It was her graduation film. So it's likely that was made over months, not years. There was pressure to make that film. Yeah. Anything to add to that?
No, films do take a lot of time and money, and they are often, those kinds of films are often, what do you call them, sort of people say they're passion projects, because they do cost a lot, because they're so time intensive, and you've got to pay, sort of trying to pay everybody. So that's often what takes the time, because people have got to put bread on the table. So if nobody's actually paying them, like a studio won't necessarily go, oh, sure, you've got this animation, here's, I don't know, 100,000 or 300,000 or 500,000. They'll wait, and then it comes out, and everyone's like, great, we'll buy that, we'll distribute that. So it takes a long time, but it's worth it if you've got a story that you want to tell.
What do you think we can do as a younger generation to keep the Holocaust Memorial as important as it should be?
I think the first thing is to thank the students that have come here today, and to the schools that have promoted you coming here today. That in itself is really important. Of course, the stories now are recorded, they're written. We have very few survivors left to tell these stories, but the films are still being made, as I said, many, many films, and maybe these will inspire you to go on to become storytellers, filmmakers yourself. But if not that, to display and follow up the interest that you have, and hopefully that's been stimulated today, to learn these stories and to talk about them and to understand how they relate to wartime today as well.
Yeah, I would just add, just to keep being curious really about other experience, and to not let any kind of prejudices get in the way of that, but to always be exploring and expanding your knowledge and understanding of history, and sort of make up your own mind, in that journey, in that process. That's what I would say, sort of about being curious, continuing to be curious.
I just wanted to point out something I appreciated about Girl 60427, in how sometimes when there is archival footage, it kind of can create a bit of a disconnect. you see like black and white footage and you think, oh, that was such a long time ago. And then to bring it into something more modern, I feel like bridges the gap quite well. And the use of the animation kind of simplifies it into a way that makes it more accessible to introducing the conversation to maybe younger generations.
So I think the question, it was more a comment about how animation brought the story to life in a more emotive way than seeing archive material, which is often, of course, used in films about the Holocaust. So what I gather is that you appreciated the use of animation. And yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. We have several hands there. Yeah.
So mine's going more off of the first person's question and kind of opposing the question just before this. I was just thinking, do you not think sometimes it's better to use like archival media so that the message doesn't get lost and kind of see like a fantasy or like fictional? For example, like in The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, where the message about who was actually oppressed kind of gets lost. Do you not think sometimes it's more impactful for someone to see archival media, even though it can be quite harrowing, just to feel the full impact of what happened?
I mean, many Holocaust films do use archival material. And I think Amanda referenced, often the same archival material is used, which actually can eventually deteriorate from its impact. Although I have recently seen new archival material, which has really both shocked and impressed on me the relevance, as you're saying, of using it. But what do you think about the power of archive?
It can be really powerful and really shocking. There's a film called Night Will Fall, is it? Mm-hmm. Which is about the liberation of Birkenau. And it's actually probably the most shocking thing you'll ever see on film, almost, well, not, but it's right up there. And it's torturous, and you can't, not everyone can watch that, and not everyone wants to watch that because it's horrific. One of the things we talked about here, so yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways to make film, and when you come across new archive, there's a film called 3 Minutes, A Lengthening, which uses 3 minutes of archive about a town in Poland, footage just before Hitler invaded, 1938, I think. Someone had arrived there with a camera, and everyone was really excited because they hadn't seen cameras before, tiny little town, and they're all jumping about, and the whole film is made up of these 3 minutes of archive. It's a really brilliantly made, powerful film if you want to watch it. Just really, you just learn a lot about this moment before the war and the Holocaust began. But what we talked about was how sometimes not seeing stuff is where the power is, the power of our imagination to think about things. And both of those films, I think, play on that in really clever ways. And so it's sort of what you don't see that gives it its strength and its storytelling. But I agree, I mean, both can be very powerful in the right hands, whoever's telling the story.
Because the second film was like based on a true story, do you think that as we get further from like the world that actually happened in, and like the remaining survivors sort of aren't with us anymore, do you think the way that the stories are told will sort of change?
That's an interesting question. You're making a film at the moment, you don't have the survivor with you, so maybe you'd like to answer that?
Well, just to say, I mean, I think yes, and also that speaks to the importance of us continuing to tell these stories, because the people who experienced it firsthand won't be around with us soon, to be able to share that real lived experience. So then it falls to the rest of us to be carrying these stories. So yes, I think it will change. And the way we tell stories and how we find, I mean, if any of you have seen Zone of Interest, you know, we have seen so many films about what happened inside the camp, and the filmmaker chose to step out of the camp and again use this sort of imagination, use sound very powerfully, use, you know, the sort of juxtaposition of the inside and the outside, the freedom, the flowers, the supposed carefreeness of what was happening outside. For those who haven't seen it, it's worth seeing. But yeah, I think we'll find new ways of telling stories. We have to, we must.
Yes, and we're impacted also upon, because of the wars that are happening today. I think so the filmmakers make their films now with that knowledge of what is still happening in our world. So yes, things change.
How would you think the younger generation would think would happen during the Holocaust if they were never told about it from the survivors firsthand?
We have so much information, and as we were just saying, you know, there is still new archive film and new archive written material coming out. I mean, I agree, eventually we won't have new information to add, but there's a huge amount. And as you saw, you know, in the second film, some people have not yet shared, you know, there are still discoveries to be made about first-hand experience of the Holocaust. But yes, you know, we really prize the seeing and hearing the survivors. Last question.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you what you think, because I thought what was nice about both films is how they brought in other stories and other aspects of the Holocaust for those who experienced it. And though it's sort of telling the story of the horror and the terror of what they experienced, but also bringing in the love that they had with the people around them, or also the hope. And I just thought, Amanda, as you're a filmmaker and going through the process of making a film at the moment, what you think about sort of getting the balance of conveying the horror that they experienced, but also balancing it with the community that they felt and the sort of compassion for the other people that were around them at the same time?
I mean, I think when you're telling stories, you always need things to be relatable. And if something feels too distant, you know, you'll lose your audience. And what's powerful, I keep using that word, they're very powerful. But, you know, what touches me is exactly that. I mean, the mother's distress at losing her child, the way she tries to protect. I mean, both films are really about protecting, in a way, that next generation from, you know, real life horror that happens. But when you're a child, you're slightly protected, or hopefully you're protected. We talked about this, didn't we? So, in a sense, it's that humanizing of experience that is, as a storyteller, you want to reach to your audience with. And so I think it's great to pick up on that. That's the stuff that kind of gets you, doesn't it? You know, brings a tear to your eyes, that sense of loss and not being able to protect these innocent children from what happened.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end, with thinking about the innocence of the children. Thank you very much for your attention.